the 60s was an exciting period because we were obviously proceeding from the end of World War II and involved in the Korean conflict.
It was a tumultuous time when we believed that we could do anything. No matter what it was, we could accomplish it. So people were exploring.
It was a time, obviously, at the beginning of great hope when my uncle was elected president of the United States, the first Irish Catholic to become president. That was a major breakthrough. And then my father was the Attorney General. Having a brother team as the President and the Attorney General was really quite extraordinary. And it was the time of the Civil Rights Movement.
To watch what was happening in our country, marches, people looking for equality, expressing themselves much more openly than this country had ever seen before, emboldened by a leader like Martin Luther King.
You had folks like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X. They were all coming up and they were using different tactics to address the ills that were occurring in the country.
As a black young woman, I found it to be a very exciting time because there were things that you could participate in that gave you new liberties.
I think that my father's campaign for the presidency was also, a highlight. So exciting about the idea that there was somebody who could, bring black and white together, working men and women of all races.
It was a roller coaster ride. We had the world by the tail. We were going to make it into a better place. And by the summer of that year, it didn't look quite that way anymore.
Dr. King was planning the Poor People's March that was going to take place in Washington, D.C. And he started reading about the striking workers. He started reading about their plight and how the city had ignored their issues and was not treating them as men, and he made the decision that he had to travel to Memphis.
He saw this campaign as being the campaign that would bring this issue to the attention of the nation.
He went there to show solidarity. And it proved a point at that juncture in history that labor rights, our human rights, our civil rights, all lumped together. You can't separate it.
If you recall, they had a slogan, and they carried the signs that simply said, "I am a man."
It put a chill on me when I first saw the signs, "I am a man." And I realized just exactly how basic that fight was. That fight was for them to be recognized as human beings.
Part of the misunderstanding of the Memphis sanitation strike is the assumption that these were workers who had big time economic demands. I mean, the simple demand that they had was to be treated with respect and a degree of dignity, and their signs simply reflected the fact that I am a man and I expect to be treated as one, even though I do this dreadful job.
They were called boy. They were not able to change their uniforms in hot Memphis. I mean, in Memphis gets hot. They were not given the proper equipment, the proper uniforms, so they were very angry.
They didn't have a collective bargaining agreement or access to collective bargaining, so they could sit down across the table with those who made decisions and talk about the conditions under which they work or the pay that they were to receive for the work. And so Dr. King saw this as the classic contradiction in our economic system, that poor workers had no access to justice as we knew it in the collective bargaining concept.
What really forced those workers, those 1,300 African-American sanitation workers, to say enough is enough was that two of their brothers, sanitation workers, were actually crushed in a truck. They made the decision that in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968, in the Deep South, 1,300 sanitation workers, African Americans, would go on strike. Not only for better wages and benefits, but it was for dignity and respect.
Thank you very kindly, my friends.
he spoke at the Mason Temple, and that was his mountaintop speech.
Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right.
It was, for me, one of the most powerful speeches I've ever heard. You could not make a speech like that and not understand the conditions under which these people worked.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop.
When he finished the speech, he was tired because he had put everything into it. And I sat there on the stage and was just mesmerized by the fact that not only his oratory, but his ability to tie all these issues together was just so profound.
He had a message to tell the folks that were gathered in Mason Temple, but he was also sending a message to the rest of the country and the rest of the world that we had to continue to make our voices heard.
I may not get there with you.
Whether he would be with us or not, that responsibility was ours.
That we as a people will get to the promised land.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King.
April 4th of 1968, I was 80 miles away, getting ready for Bobby Kennedy, who was going to come to Ohio for a primary stop.
I can feel the tears welling up, thinking about it.
I was in class that day, and the professor announced that Dr. King had been assassinated, and it was like our whole world just got shaken.
I mean, there was collective sorrow and crying immediately, and we were told that school would be dismissed.
I was going to a high school right outside of Cleveland in a suburb, and all of the African American students got together and we decided that we were going to walk out.
It was surreal. It was as if someone was telling you a bedtime story that you didn't want to hear the end of.
I could not believe my ears when the news reports came in that this can't be happening again so soon after the assassination of President Kennedy.
How could anybody want to take his life for standing up for workers who are trying to get the most basic human rights? I don't know that we ever recovered from that.
There were police all over because they felt that trouble might start, but we were going down to make a statement. We were going down to make a statement that we had lost a leader, and the fight and the battle and the struggle would continue.
For the first time in my life, I experienced martial law. And that was terrifying. I mean, to not be able to go outside of your house at night, to have troops, coming down the street in jeeps and pointing guns at us and saying, "Get in the house, go in the house," was absolutely terrifying. And it just added to the sorrow that we felt.
When Dr. King was assassinated, it was on. Like the kids say today, it was on and popping. Folks wanted to hit something to get that one good lick in to let you know that there was anger that was there, even though the lesson had been peace, calm, and stability. It was like crossing the line in the sand.
There were many riots in a number of cities, including Cleveland. People were angry. They were frustrated. One of their leaders had been assassinated, and they reacted in a very violent way.
They believed that if they killed Dr. King, it would kill the civil rights movement. It would kill the fight for workers' rights and for human dignity, and it had the exact opposite effect.
People came together and order was restored, really based upon community leaders going out and urging people to remain calm.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
One of the things that happened that night was when my father went to Indianapolis. He was campaigning for the presidency, and this was the time before cell phones and iPhones and instant communication. And when he landed, he was told what had happened to the Reverend King, and the police chief and the mayor said, "Don't go into the inner city. It's too dangerous." And there was reason to say that because, as you know, over 100 cities did break out in flames. But my father said, this is what my campaign is about, is to reaching people when they are in pain and seeing what I can do to make people feel that they're part of this country.
Robert Kennedy went in the middle of that crowd, stood up on the back of a truck, and gave what I think is one of the finest speeches of all time.
Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings.
He gave this extraordinary speech about the fact that his brother was also killed by a white man, and there was a gasp from the crowd because he was telling them for the first time what had happened. And then he talked about his own pain and how we can gain wisdom through suffering, quoting Aeschylus from the Greeks. And then he ended up saying what we need in this country is a feeling of love and compassion for those who suffer, whether they be white or whether they be black.
But his love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black.
His talk touched people's hearts, and in Indianapolis, it was peaceful.
I was encouraged and still had hope. And then that didn't last too long.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968.
"50 years later, I look at 1968 as the year, the 60s in general, that we lost the last of the real leaders, the people with vision, with boldness, with determination, whether it was perceived popularly or not. They knew what was right, and they proceeded to deliver what was right."
It would be wrong to say that we have not found change or brought about change. I think Barack Obama is a dominant change that occurred from the movements of the 60s.
I always say this, that in order for us to understand where we've got to go, we've got to understand where we came from. And Memphis, the sanitation workers' strike, the death of Dr. King, that's a part of not only African American history, not only a part of labor history, but it's a part of American history, and we can never forget it.
All that he did before his assassination could not be buried when his body was laid down, because his example was planted, taught, and then remembered through practice. Kill the dreamer, but you can't kill the dream.
He lived his life, and he died doing everything that he believed in. There is no challenge, there is no question to the legacy that he left.
So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.